Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ICA. I'm Monica Garza, the Director of Education. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program with Mark Dion and Andrea Barrett. This program was organized in conjunction with the opening of Mark Dion, Misadventures of a 21st Century Naturalist. Now, before we get started, how many of you have seen the exhibition upstairs already? About half, it looks like. Yeah, okay. Do know that our galleries will remain open till 9 o'clock, so after the talk, if you'd like to go back upstairs and take a second look at the artwork, we invite you. I saw a lot of you in the cage with the birds. I did see that. Now, before inviting our speakers on the stage, let me share with you some biographical information. Mark Dion was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He studied... Anyone else from New Bedford? Oh, there you go. He studied at the Hartford Art School of the University of Hartford in Connecticut, the School of Visual Arts in New York, and then the Whitney Museum of American Art's Independent Study Program in the mid-'80s. He has received numerous awards throughout his career, including the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award, and has had major exhibitions at the Miami Art Museum, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art, and the British Museum of Natural History in London. Through commissioned projects, Dion has presented in institutions such as the Seattle Art Museum, the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco, Rose Art Museum at Brandeis, and the Montevideo Biennale in Uruguay. Aside from his work with museums, Dion is also the co-director of Mildred's Lane, a 96-acre site that, according to its website, I'm going to quote this, attempts to co-evolve a rigorous pedagogical strategy where a working, living, researching environment has been developed to foster engagement with every aspect of life. The ICA's Mark Dion, Misadventures of a 21st Century Naturalist is the artist's first museum survey in the United States. Andrea Barrett was born in Boston and raised in Cape Cod. According to her bio on her website, she began writing seriously in her 30s. She published her first novel, Lucid Stars, in 1988, and in 1996 received the National Book Award for her book, Ship Fever. According to the Boston Globe, Ship Fever contains, quote, beautiful stories about the wonder and work of science. In Barrett's hands, science is transformed from hard and known fact into malleable, strange, and thrilling fictional material. Her other books include Servants of the Map, which was a finalist for the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, The Air We Breathe, and most recently, Archangel, a finalist for the Story Prize. In 2001, Barrett received a MacArthur Fellowship, an award more commonly known as a Genius Award. Barrett teaches writing at Williams College and continues to reside in Massachusetts. Now, after Dion and Barrett share with you some of their work up on the podium, they'll be joined on the stage by Ruth Erickson, the ICA's Mannion Family Senior Curator. Erickson oversaw Dion's ambitious exhibition upstairs and the very ambitious catalog that accompanies the ambitious exhibition, and she'll help moderate the conversation portion of our program. Lastly, I want to thank the Ronnie Casti Lecture Fund for their generosity to help make this program possible. And now, please help me welcome Mark Dion.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to talk upstairs. There's an awful lot of work, and there's a lot of work that I couldn't represent, but somehow try to make a nod to some of these larger public projects, art in public spaces, and works that we made dioramas of because we couldn't bring the Seattle Vivarium or the Den here this time. Right? So I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that's missing upstairs, which are collaborations with institutions, where I get to work with all sorts of exciting and strange museums, like the British Museum of Natural History. So in 2007, there was an anniversary at the British Museum. Well, there's an anniversary around the world of the birth of Carl Linnaeus. You know, Carl Linnaeus is the Swedish botanist who modernized the system of taxonomy, created the binomial system of nomenclature that we all know. He was a fantastic teacher. He was a physician. He was a botanist. He was one of the, there are a few superstars in the history of natural history. There are people like Aristotle and Darwin and Rachel Carson, and certainly Linnaeus is one of them. So as his 300th birthday is coming up, the London Museum realizes, oh no, we've been focusing so much on Darwin's 200th birthday, we forgot about Linnaeus. What are we going to do? So they have to, when a museum like that realizes, well, we've left this too long to actually get any loans, there's not an enormous amount of material culture left that the Swedes aren't doing an exhibition on Linnaeus. So what can we do? And when you get into a problem like that, very often you invite an artist. So this is the Museum of Natural History in London. It is a fantastic museum. This is what the interior looks like now. This is what it looked like before they ruined it. And this is the Waterhouse building is one of the most exciting and marvelous purpose-built buildings for a museum space and for a natural history museum. And the museum has, since its original installation, been doing nothing but ruining the space by modernizing their exhibitions. As you know, I'm a museum fundamentalist. I think once you install a museum, you should never change it. So, they don't really agree with me there. So anyway, so they invite me to do a project with around Linnaeus. Linnaeus publishes in 1735 Systema Naturae, the first real articulation of a system that could become a universal, in quotes, system for classifying animals. It's not very large, the first edition, but it goes on to have 10 editions during his lifetime. And it's a system based on the idea of a type specimen, right? So there's one organism that is that others that get to bear its name is based on. So when you need to reference, is this a different species? You need to go back to that type specimen. Linnaeus himself is the type specimen for Homo sapien, for example, because he described Homo sapien based on his own self. This is him in his younger days, his travels in Lapland. And one of the other things that Linnaeus does is really set this template for naturalists that's followed beyond the 18th century into the 19th century and 20th century of the naturalist who has an expedition early in their career. And that expedition is dramatically influential in forming their ideas later on. So, and also, it marries this kind of model of science and adventure. And so that's very much what you see in people like Spruce and Bates and Wallace and Darwin and von Humboldt. They all have that, they all follow this template. So he is enormously influential. And of course, this importance of refining the system of the field of systematics is what I was interested in. In coming to the museum, they gave me this enormous gallery and said, here we're going to celebrate, or here you're going to celebrate Linnaeus. So I think, okay, this is going to be a challenge because the first thing I need to do is tell the public who Linnaeus is. And a lot of my work deals with people in the history of natural history, the history of sciences, and so I'm always in the place where I have to bring the viewer up to speed. I can't just make assumptions that people know who William Bartram and Linnaeus and William Beebe and people like this are. So I create an exhibition that is a preamble to my exhibition, and I'm able to borrow specimens from the Linnaean Society. Everything that Linnaeus collected, of course, since he was the founder of the system, is the type specimen. So his collection have the most type specimens. And those specimens, many of them, live in an atom bomb-proof bunker under the Linnaean Society. You have to descend many layers of stairs to end up in front of this giant vault. And in that vault are the plants that Linnaeus collected. A lot of Linnaeus' specimens had been eaten by mice and moths, but they're bought and brought to England. There's a lot of stories of how these things get to England. The story I was told by the head of botany was that after his death, because he was a university professor, his family wasn't so wealthy, his wife wanted to sell, his widow wanted to sell the collection to the King of Sweden. The King of Sweden was actually on vacation in Italy. So she couldn't wait any longer. Joseph Banks, the British botanist, found out about this being available. He went in, he purchased the collection, loaded it on a ship, and it was sailing back to London when the King of Sweden arrived back and sent an armada to intercept the ship, but it ended up in London. And that short story is entirely false. So it's a great story. It's just not the accurate story. So instead, his son sold it to another British botanist named Smith. Years later, as I said, the collection had been very damaged by mice and things like that. But nevertheless, it is in Britain, and it is the most important collection in terms of orthodox taxonomy. And they never lent anything to anyone, although I convinced them, I mean, really, like never. I convinced them to lend several things to the exhibition, several things, very important plants, very important to artist life. One is the type specimen for coffee. One is the type specimen for marijuana, and one is the type specimen for cocaine. So these were lent. And here is the figure of Linnaeus against this backdrop of wallpaper, which he wallpapered the interior of his home with the prints for his book that were not perfect. So the seconds, he actually, instead of wasting them, used them as wallpaper. There are drawings of his system. You see him here as he's depicted, the second Pliny, the master of organization, the person who makes sense of the natural world. His vision was that the world itself was God's museum. It's a kind of great idea. Here are depictions of Linnaeus, who you can imagine is kind of quite stodgy academic guy, but you see him surrounded by beautiful muses as he's dead here, surrounded by putti. He was very much, even in his time, a celebrity. So people like Rousseau and Goethe write about how important he is, about how he is a poet of science. This cabinet that you see next to it is actually the cabinet that the Linnaeus' specimens were sent. And when I went to the Linnaean Society, I said, well, what kinds of things do you have from Linnaeus? And they're like, we just have the specimens, and we're not going to give those to you. And I said, and every time you open the vault door, you bang into this cabinet. I said, what's the cabinet? I said, oh, that's Linnaeus' cabinet that the specimens were in. I said, oh, can I borrow that? And suddenly, this thing which had been banged by this vault door for, 80 years, they're like, oh no, that's quite valuable. We have to have it assessed by the insurance company before we can lend it to you. So anyway, they did give it to me. And here are some examples of, of course, how one keeps plants and identifies plants is through herbaria, through these plant presses. So these are models of pre-Linnaean presses. So these are monastery books, for example, where the plant is bound into the book, and they even paint artificial grass at the base of the plant. Or I love this one where there's a stamp of an urn, and they plant the plant specimen in the urn. So this is on its way to becoming the science that Linnaeus disciplines in a way. So I wanted to talk about what systematics means today for the city of London. Like, there are a lot of dramatic changes in systematics, and one of the greatest problems that the Natural History Museum is having is the way systematics has been conducted up until that point using comparative anatomy, like comparing organisms and comparing parts of organisms and finding out if they are different or the same, and which has been the way to do it since Linnaeus. And then, of course, new molecular technologies. Looking at DNA, this gives us a whole new set of tools. And there was a lot of talk at this time about the barcoding of life, that every organism would have a barcode. So we don't really need to have these stuffed skins and animals in formalin at the museum. We can just have these barcodes and samples. So these groups, the orthodox taxonomists, the anatomical based people and the molecular people are not friends. They are both in the fields of systematics, but at that time they were really at odds with each other. So I wanted to create these ways to bring this discussion into to the forefront, and also be in a very playful way, and also talk a little bit about field work. So our first project was we took this smart car and we drove the longest road in London with this, it looks like a kind of pizza delivery thing on the top, except it's actually sticky paper. And so all of the insects that the car hit would stick to this paper. And then we brought it back to the museum, and we had a contest between the people who work with comparative anatomy and the people who work with molecular technologies to identify these splotches and these organisms that had hit the car. And so this was a quite exciting and fun thing within the museum itself, but also a great way to talk about some of these changes and differences. And so we have this simulated laboratory which shows the things we found, and also some of their family relationships, their cladograms. And it turns out that the anatomists, the comparative anatomists, were quicker and, in the end, more accurate, because the molecular people, it just takes time to do that. It's very accurate in the end, except on a few occasions, they were getting the DNA of what the insect ate. So we would have a blob that was clearly a beetle, but it was coming up as a grain of rice, right? And so we knew it wasn't a grain of rice. They don't have legs. And so this was a really interesting way to kind of talk about some of these differences. And of course, the sane people in systematics understand that these are complementary techniques, right? That there really is no need to have a war between this. These are just two ways of getting to the same point, and 99% of the time they support what, the molecular research supports what physical analysis had done, and in the cases that it doesn't, it's really a revelation and surprising and quite interesting and useful. So all of the projects around this exhibition were trying to find ways to bring this to light, to talk about it, to identify how systematics is changing in also things that Londoners were talking about. So London had just won the Olympics pretty recently before this. So one of the things we did was we went to the football stadium that was going to be destroyed to make the Olympic football stadium. And this is Mark Spencer, he's the head of botany there, and he and I removed a square meter of these. This is a football pitch, so this is like, this is the soccer field. A square meter of the grass from the soccer field, and then we went out to the parking lot and removed a square meter of the parking lot's grass, and then we brought them into the museum side by side and grew them to see what is the biodiversity of each of these lots. And we made herbaria from this, so one could look and see these two lots growing side by side. The Natural History Museum has a rule that no living organisms are allowed to be inside the museum, outside of visitors. And so this was actually very challenging, and we had to make this quite airtight because it's not allowed to have living plants in the museum. But nevertheless, they bent the rules for me. Another advantage of being the artist. So this is the soccer stadium. Needless to say, it's two types of grass. And then this is the parking lot, right? The parking lot has a kind of, considering it is an unattended lot, it's not planted, it just has this very surprising diversity of native British things and also things from all over the world. A lot of the people who work at the Natural History Museum, even though they mostly work in laboratories and are staring at computer screens for the majority of their day, they became biologists because of a love for nature and a love for being out of doors. And I spent a lot of time with biologists who, sometimes, every maybe 5 years, go to a place for 2 weeks and they collect organisms, and then they bring them back to the laboratory and study them for 5 years. And when you go out for a beer with them, perhaps it's not surprising they never talk about the laboratory stuff. They want to talk about the 2 weeks in the field, right? They live for that. And yet, a lot of their decisions take them away from that. A lot of their inquiry does. So I wanted to do a field trip for the department I kind of love the most, the entomology department and the invertebrate department. And so we decided we would go to 3 different cemeteries in London and look at the gravestones of 3 social reformers. So this is the gravestone of Emmeline Pankhurst, the blue stocking, the suffragette, and we collected all of the invertebrates we could get our hands on in, on, and around the grave. This is not a dwarf. This is Karl Marx. This is Karl Marx's grave. So we collected all of the organisms we could around the grave of Karl Marx. And this is the grave of Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, this great promoter of public education and evolution, and great champion of social justice and education for the masses. So, needless to say, this is incredibly absurd and unscientific, right? Collecting things from these very different grave sites tells you absolutely nothing about these contexts, but and they were installed in this way. So we had the findings. Again, one of the great things of working with institutions like the Museum of Natural History in London is they have the great toys, right? So we had access to these remarkably powerful and clear imaging technologies, and you could compare the organisms from these different social reformers' graves, which tells you very little, but is a very interesting and, needless to say, fun thing. And I was very, and all of these pieces have video of the field work as well. And what was really interesting is at the end of the year, British institutions are obsessed with the idea of assessment. Everything must be constantly assessed, and so the staff had to write assessments, and they called me and they said, everyone who worked with you on these crazy projects, they wrote about that as like one of the high points of their year. And they said this like they were completely shocked. I was like, well, I'm happy to hear that, but it was a high point in my year too. And so, these are some of the incredibly rich images that we produced. And again, I'm very interested in the material culture of science, in the way that an ethnographer goes to a society that's very different from her own, and she's taking notes and she's looking at the things that people have and what they do and what they prioritize. I'm interested in this very strange tribe of people called scientists and the material culture that they have. That their stuff is really telling to me and interesting. And of course, there we have the photographs or images of the people whose graves we looked at, and the graves, and the list. And of course, Huxley has the most because he was buried under an oak tree, and oak trees are, magnificent for biodiversity. So the last of the sites was the intake filter for the Thames Power Station. So, oh my goodness, can't be done yet. No. So we looked at, working with the Department of Ichthyology and Marine Biology, we cleaned the intake filters to see what we could possibly find there. And in the case of the first experiment with the car, we found a South African beetle that had never been registered in Britain. So it was this kind of discovery. In this case, we found the third only seahorse to be found in the Thames. This was an incredibly disgusting thing to do, by the way, cleaning the filter. And so, and despite the fact that we had sanitized everything to the best of our ability, we had to show it in this covered polytunnel, which was also nice because I didn't want to show everything too clearly. And so you could see everything through the polytunnel. There was a little vent where you could smell everything through the polytunnel. And this is the kind of view if you could look inside and you would see these categories like this. It looks like a kind of group of unusual geological specimens. That, of course, is styrofoam. And of course, these are some of the organisms, some of the pipefish and the leopard sharks, and of course our seahorse. And I think there was some kind of fraternity or some organization who did a race with rubber ducks. So I think I'm actually out of time. That's really a shame because I have so many other things to show you. And like a lot of my projects, and if you go upstairs and see the cupboard, you will find that there are these field guides. And I produce these small books because, again, I often have this problem of having to bring the public up to speed and to build a context around the interventions. So these books are a kind of simple and eloquent way of doing that. So I think that's going to be it. Thank you very much. I'll just show you some of the things I can't show you. I think we want to end it there, yeah. About 20 minutes.
This is the best thing I've ever read in front of, ever. I thought the best way to honor Mark's work would be to read just a little bit from something I wrote that deals with the same kind of materials that he likes to work with. It's rooted in some of the late 19th and early 20th century natural history artifacts that we like to play with as we make our various kinds of work. This is a story called Wonders of the Shore. It has to do with oceanography and marine biology. And each of the story sections opens with a few lines that closely resemble but are not identical with extracts from Augusta Foote Arnold's classic guide to the seashore, which is called The Sea Beach at Ebb Tide. I wrote about the book in an essay in the wonderful catalog that Ruth Erickson put together for this show. And part of what that did was to make me imagine the lives of the largely forgotten women who did this sort of work in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'll just read you the story's opening pages. 1. The seashore, with its stretches of sandy beach and rocks, seems at first sight nothing but a barren waste, merely the natural barrier of the ocean. But to the observant eye, these apparently desolate reaches are not only teeming with life, they are also replete with suggestions of the past. They are the pages of a history full of fascination for one who has learned to read them. The cover is a faded olive, not flashy, not the first thing you'd pull from a bookshelf. Wonders of the Shore. Black type, black decorations, a small silhouette of a fiddler crab, a pair of stylized starfish bracketing the author's name. Coiled snails frame the wonder, while sea anemones frame the shore. Actually, it is attractive, in a sober, subtle way. Someone labored over that design, and over the photographs too, reprinted from many sources, but freshly labeled and crowded on thick, glossy paper, which makes the book heavy. The writing is old-fashioned, more detailed than we're used to now. It was published in 1889. The author, Daphne Bannister, thanks a long list of people at the end of her preface. Some are professors at places like Harvard and Barnard, others curators or, the women, assistants at the Smithsonian. Especially thanked are Celia Thaxter, whose kind invitations to Thaxter Cottage made my working visits to the hotel such a pleasure, and my dear friend and stalwart companion, Miss Henrietta Atkins. Henrietta's great niece, Suki Marburg, left the book behind with her other things, and for a long time, no one looked at it. 2. It is hoped that this book will suggest a new interest and pleasure to many, and that it will serve as a practical guide to this branch of natural history without necessitating serious study. Marine organisms are interesting acquaintances when once introduced, and the real purpose of the author is to present to the latent naturalist friends whom he will enjoy. Celia Thaxter is easy to trace. She wrote a book of poems, a collection of pieces about the beloved island where she was raised, a book about her garden. There are letters, too, and portraits and photographs, and a couple of biographies. Daphne, who wrote under 2 different names, is harder to classify, but she had her day as well, and people in Hammondsport noticed her, a woman visiting repeatedly, traveling on her own. At the drugstore, at the theater, walking along the lake with her friend, pale hair improbably thick above her sharp features and delicate neck, or skating, she had tiny feet, but was very fast, in a costume showing more leg than was usual in this part of upstate New York. Some were annoyed by her manners. After one visit, the Crooked Lake Gazette reported, "Among those arriving last week by train from Bath was Miss Daphne Bannister, here for one of her frequent stays with our esteemed biology teacher, Miss Henrietta Atkins. A well-known authoress, Miss Bannister has written guides to the insect pests, the wildflowers of Massachusetts, where she makes her home, and the birds of the fields and farms. She traveled from the Cornell campus, where she presented a talk on the parasitic nematodes." That one, the gossip said. Henrietta's friend. All around Keuka Lake, people were aware of Henrietta. Mention of her in the Gazette goes back as far as grade school. Winner of the spelling bee. Student fossil collection impresses visitors. Sisters show off lake trout caught in fishing derby. Later articles note her departure for Oswego, where she went for her teacher training, and the grant she received when she finished. She met Daphne after she graduated at a summer school for the study of natural history run by Louis Agassiz. After that, she came back home to teach biology at the Hammondsport High School. She established the Natural History Club, the Fossil Collectors Club, an ice skating group, a reading group. Several times she won teaching awards. All of this is noted in the Gazette. Henrietta, so firmly rooted wherever she stands that she looks tall unless she's next to someone else, ages silently in the photographs. Her skirts narrow, then rise, then give way to voluminous slacks. Her sleeves are always pushed back from her sturdy wrists and blunt-fingered hands, lines appearing as her hair grays and metamorphoses from a mass pinned at the back of her neck to a neat crop just below her ears. Grateful students mention her as they in turn appear in the newspaper for one thing or another. Appreciative colleagues thank her as they retire. The tone is invariably kind, except for the notes about Daphne's visits, which are colored by something that wouldn't be there if either of the women had married. Now they seem to point at something. They might not have read that way then. 3. Every coastline shows the destructive effects of the sea. For the bays and coves, the caves at the bases of the cliffs, the buttresses and needles are the work of the waves. And this work is constantly going on. The knotty sticks so commonly seen on the beach are often the hearts of oak or cedar trees, from which the tiny crystals of sand have slowly cut away their less solid outer growth. In August of 1885, Henrietta was 33 and had been teaching high school for 12 years. Although her sister, Hester, was almost a decade younger, she'd married 2 years earlier and left Henrietta alone at home with their mother. This had suited Henrietta very well, until her friend Mason Perrott, an ambitious farmer who she'd known for some time, began to court her attentively, confusingly. Now, after 7 months of thinking one way about this in the morning and another in the afternoon, she knew he was about to propose. She was fond of him, as was her mother. If she was going to change her life and start a family, it was surely time. But to leave her job after all she'd put into it, no point to that unless she could do more work, not less, as Daphne had after leaving her own teaching job. And her mother's argument that Henrietta would be teaching her own children wasn't wholly convincing. She and Daphne had shared a vacation every summer since they'd met, which didn't always mean Daphne visiting Henrietta. Sometimes Henrietta went to the little town in western Massachusetts, where Daphne, having pried herself free from her parents and her brothers, had bought herself a tiny white house. And twice they'd managed to stay at a resort. Once in the White Mountains, once in Rhode Island. What luxury to have their meals cooked and their rooms cleaned. Henrietta had been Daphne's guest both times, which might have been awkward if instead of pointing out that the income she made from her books was much greater than Henrietta's small salary, Daphne had not insisted graciously that those books wouldn't exist without Henrietta's help, so the treat was simply Henrietta's due. This year, having done especially well, Daphne had offered 3 weeks at the hotel on Appledore Island, a few miles off the New Hampshire coast. On the day before Henrietta began her journey to the island, Mason came from his farm in Pulteney with a tin of ginger snaps for the train ride and a big white canvas hat that tied with 2 strips of muslin under her chin. He was wearing a blue checked shirt he knew she particularly liked. She could feel him trying to get her alone, but instead she sat steadfastly with her mother at the table, making lists of what she should bring and what she should read during this stretch of uninterrupted time. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you. So this is the book that we made for the show, and in it, as Andrea mentioned, she wrote a really lovely contribution to the book. And at the introduction to her essay, she makes a strong connection between your 2 upbringings. And I'll just read just a few lines of it as a way to start this conversation. So Andrea writes, "If you look at a map of Buzzards Bay, you'll find New Bedford, Mark Dion's hometown, on one side of the bay, and Bourne on the other. I lived in several of Bourne's small villages as a girl, and Dion and I are close enough in age that I can imagine us gazing at similar landscapes and life forms. Tidal flats, salt marshes, beds of clams and oysters, schools of striped bass and bluefish knitting together our opposite shores, seagulls crossing the sky, and everywhere water, everywhere boats. Perhaps those surroundings infected us similarly." It was such a lovely way for me to start thinking of you 2 kind of together, in as many ways the inspiration for bringing you here tonight. I think obviously your shared interests in the natural world and the people who have studied it and the institutions who have supported its study, but also this connection that you both share to Massachusetts and to growing up here and to coastal Massachusetts in particular. And I'm also struck that both of you in different interviews have described your own families as families that are didn't value books and didn't necessarily have the kind of access to art and to learning. I mean, in one interview, Andrea, that I read, you described your household as very unintellectual. And I would consider that both of you at this point are, incredibly studied and really value learning and are incredibly curious people, which is one of the greatest signs to me of intelligence. So I just wonder, is there a sort of story at which growing up looking across at the same shore in families that maybe didn't value learning as much, that you then were inspired and sort of made this turn to be the writer and the artist that you are today that engages so deeply with intellectual history?
wow, start with the easy stuff.
Biography. Biography's easy, it's your life.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a house devoid of books, but the one book that was there was the Golden Guide to the Seashore. You know, these little golden guides, which
I remember those.
They're so fantastic, and the illustrations are amazing, and they always start with this section of things that one can do to collect. So it shows you how to press seaweed and how to make a shell collection and what information you need. And I was always confounded by these because they would have these things like, what you need is an eyedropper. And I'd be like, oh my God, where can I find an eyedropper? And like a butterfly net. I've never seen a butterfly net. And my parents were not helpful in that way of being able to get me those things. So I think that undoubtedly has something to do with my obsession with Apparatus, right?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Finally, you can have all the butterfly nets
I
you
can
want.
have as many as I want, and I have so many. It's shameful. Yeah.
Well, maybe part of what not having books and some of the Apparatus did for both of us is it made us go outside and look at the stuff instead of the books because we didn't have the books, and maybe it made us invent the Apparatus too, or I'm just fishing here, which is a strange metaphor to use in this context. Yeah. But I do remember very sharply being, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, those years, always being outside and trying to make what I now know the word for is, they're like tiny sculptures or installations of the seashells and the flowers, taking a bunch of rocks and pebbles and seashells and making little worlds out of those parts in the sand. And I bet you were doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah.
We would arrive at the beach. My mother's best friend had a little trailer, like an Airstream trailer on the beach. And so the car would be filled with kids, and you know, be our family and other families arrive there, and then the doors would open and everyone would head to the beach, and my brother and I would head to the salt marsh in the other direction. So it just seemed like we were taking a wrong turn, but we were playing in this very, alive space of the New England salt marsh, and amongst all of the fiddler crabs and horseshoe crabs and eels, and it was just so fantastic.
Yeah, the salt marsh is a very particular environment, and when people think of the Cape, they mostly tend to think of the, Provincetown and Wellfleet and the emptier, sandier, dunier spaces. But where I grew up and where you grew up, there really aren't nice beaches. They're long, muddy flats where the tide just goes out and out and out, and they're surrounded by salt marshes, and they're smelly, and there's jellyfish, and there's a lot of mud, but they are incredibly rich biologically and in all sorts of ways, and they have an intensity to them that really the outer beaches don't have. Those are much simpler environments, so maybe we were lucky in being around those too.
Yeah, exactly. They're just this great kind of classroom.
Yeah.
Well, I think in those sites, it seems like the layering of human culture and nature is really more, interrelated, more complex as you start kind of digging through those really kinds of muck and that kind of muck. And I know, as Mark, you showed in your presentation, you've done your share of digging through muck. One of the things that I was struck by in your talks today and in your writing, Andrea, and in many of your projects, Mark, is your interest in historical characters and figures. And sometimes those are actual people, and oftentimes those are invented people. And Mark, in some of your early pieces, you sort of played this amateur scientist, where you were setting yourself out a task and using some of the methods of a scientist, but in a kind of amateur, bumbling way. And Andrea, I was so struck in the piece that you read and in other of your writings, how you oftentimes create this kind of palimpsest of points of view, so that there will be a third-person point of view mixed in with diary entries in first person. And I just wondered, for each of you, how has this kind of personification of these figures and these characters, been a device for you as artists and as writers?
It was wonderful. I had the chance to walk through the exhibition earlier with Ruth and see, all these layers of Mark's work over the years. And so inevitably I was thinking about that way that we use both fictional and real people
we put them in the same space as if they have equal reality. And to us, to me anyway, they do have equal reality. I think, yeah, they, as artistic materials, the invented and the really real life people have equal weight in our minds. And I was thinking about, is it called the Ladies Field Group of York?
The Ladies Field Club.
So, yeah. You know, Henrietta might as well be the 9th in that series of 8 portraits. Right. It's, so she's invented, but Celia Thaxter is real, and various other characters, as that story evolves, are made up, and they stand right next to real painters who are really on that island in that real summer doing their real work. And they all are bled together in a way that, for me, is very fruitful. If I stick just to the actual historical characters, I can't get enough distance to, in effect, to abstract far enough back so that you can understand what it means to have lived in that time and place from the perspective of our time and space. I'm not trying to recreate 1885. I'm trying to create an object that will cause you to think from our perspective now about that time with some distance, if that made sense.
I love how in your work we can approach these characters through the things that are unknowable in a way, but you are projecting them. You know, Linnaeus's inner thoughts at the end of his life when he's, you know, on the verge of death and senility and regrets he may have, and this kind of this scale he's taking at the end of his life, his missteps versus his accolades, and how one has that all muddled in their mind. I mean, that's really quite wonderful, and there's no access to this in a lot of these people's real lives. Their journals are very cautious. You have wonderful people like William Beebe, who burns his private journals rather than put them in his papers in Princeton. You know, those are really, I mean, I feel like you are uncovering that in some way, and of course in a fiction, but a fiction that is so well informed, it's very plausible, and it really is expansive of the characters.
I think of you as doing a similar process when you make those explorations out in the field in a Linnaeus-like way. It's as if I'm casting back into the past and projecting, and you're projecting his way of being into the future in a certain way. You're by going out and doing those investigations in the field, you're modeling for us a way that he might have been or might be now in a certain ways.
And also, we're just using different materials, words and versus things, and I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I do too.
I think in both of your work, one of the ways that fiction operates is as what I would describe as a feminist intervention into histories, into the history of science. I mean, the Ladies Field Club of York is these, you know, women that are imagined to have been important figures within scientific fields of inquiry. And I just wondered, and there's, I think in both of your work too, a real sense of a kind of a critique of hegemony and power. And I think that's what I see as feminist in it. But I wonder if, you know, how you think about your work, and especially think about using a time period like the 19th century, when there was a lot more interest in antiquarian culture than there is now. And if you think of your work in a sort of feminist lens in its reinterrogation of history of the 19th century and in that time.
I'll let you go first. No, he says, no, you go.
Well, I think there's, you know, I think for me there's kind of two impulses. One is to look at these histories with a critical perspective, and one is to reinvent these histories that should have been or could have been. And the Ladies Field Club is a sort of example of that. It's you know, it's not something that existed, but it's something that I wish could have existed. And it's a little bit, you know, if I'm traveling back in time to create an organization that I feel like almost existed and could have existed. And certainly there were lots of women who made contributions and who traveled and did these things, but of course we don't know about them because they were forbidden to be parts of various learned societies, and they were not allowed in universities. So their contributions were kind of shadowed by being excluded from the official discourse.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, in effect, you're giving a name to and formalizing what probably did exist in a more informal form. Yeah, the idea of women, as friends working together. There's just 2 of them or 3 of them in this story. You have 8 of them in that series. There probably always were groups of people, groups of women going out and doing these things, but they didn't get to have a name or institutional support or funding or any of those things. But by putting them in these costumes and these settings, you institutionalize them in a positive way rather than a negative way.
So,
I think that's really interesting. I do think about that sometimes in my own work too. A long time ago, I wrote a story about Hans Sloane and some women who might have existed, who might have known him, who might have wanted to express those same impulses as he did as a collector and naturalist. And so it's always interesting to slip people alongside the known figures of history and try to explore the fringes of history and what hasn't been passed on. It's not that it didn't exist, it's that it didn't come down to us because those records weren't privileged in the same way, and that's really fun to play with.
For me, also, the project I did just before embarking on this, our exhibition, was this exhibition at the Drawing Center of watercolors and scientific illustrations done by the Department of Tropical Research. That was the organization out of the New York Zoological Society, which really is this kind of changing point, because that organization was always half men and half women, and also half artists and half scientists. It wasn't that the women were all the artists. There were many women scientists like Gloria Hollister and Jocelyn Crane and people like that in very important positions. And that for me was, and I did this exhibition with Catherine McLeod, who's an environmental historian, and Madeline Thompson, who's the archivist at the New York Zoological Society, or the Wildlife Conservation Society. And so this was a great kind of point in that history where the ice begins to break and things really change dramatically.
Cool.
It was an amazing project with these illustrations that are otherworldly that they made in the time. It was great, and there's a publication with that as well. I have to my last question that I have to ask you, and it's partly I read this really demoralizing, difficult New York Times article today about the 50 environmental regulations that the Trump administration has rolled back, everything from the pipelines to landfill emissions. And as 2 people that are very committed to the natural world and to the environment, though I know especially in the case of Mark has had wavering engagement with the capital, environmental movement, I just wonder in this day, which it seems like there's so much disregard for the natural world, how do you feel as practitioners and people that are committed to this work that you sort of get up in the morning and put one foot in front of the other? Because sometimes it feels like the problem is so great and the means are just not there to kind of change the will of people. And as people have been thinking about this longer than me, are there tactics that you've come to in this state where we're at in 2017 with our disregard for our environment?
I'm working with a couple of younger writers right now as students, and they have both in the last 3 weeks, we communicate largely by email. They have both asked me versions of that question, how do we get up in the morning? What is the point of making our art when all this is going on, when we feel that we can't influence everything? And they both said, literally, do you have any words of wisdom for me?
I'm asking again.
I was like, I was like, honey, I got no words. But, in the end, I had to say something to them, and all I could say was what I feel, which is that I can't even talk myself into my own practice sometimes. And yet I have to, and more importantly, I have to talk them into it. In the simplest terms, we are all given certain gifts. Some people's gifts are more useful in the active world than those of a writer's or an artist's may be, but whatever gifts we have to use them. It's a sin of some sort not to use them. If what we do is make writing or art that somehow keeps bringing the natural world in front of people, then to despair so much that we don't make that art, that's not a good thing. So we just have to keep trying. I don't know if that's an answer, but it's all I had. So.
Well, I'm incredibly pessimistic about the future. I mean, and I'm.
How can you not be?
Yeah, and I'm pissed off, and also I think a lot of my art is taking the form of mourning in a way, but being pessimistic and pissed off and mourning, those are legitimate places for art to come from, So I think that a lot of the best art is motivated by anger and by a sense of injustice, and I think that is where this work has to come from. And I think if the goal somehow is to build a progressive culture of nature, I think that comes from a lot of different places, and I'm definitely not the artist's first one on the barricade, but I am still, contributing something about. I think we both are in some way tracing back the roots of how we, came to evolve this insane relationship, this suicidal relationship to the natural world. I think what we're doing are kind of tracing back some of those footprints in the sand of where do these ideas come from, because the secret of this is lodged in the history of ideas and the history of things.
I totally agree with that. It's a set of unquestioned assumptions that's behind all this, and maybe the one small thing we can do is to make objects or make writings or make something that just for a minute makes one of those assumptions pop into view again, so we can think, oh, is that what we meant?
I know at least of one school bus that's headed out in 15 minutes, so I want to make sure that we open up to questions from the audience. So maybe we can have the house lights up. Wonderful. And I'll just, how we do it here is that you can ask the question, then and I'll repeat it. I'll try and repeat it so that everybody can hear. Yeah.
So genetic engineering has taken some really great, extraordinary strides in the past couple of years. Projects that were once explained to me as being like a PhD thesis, and the same projects now are just term papers. It's an incredibly accessible technology. Now, so these people, and there's hardly a crop out there which doesn't have a genetically engineering team working on it, trying to move it in some direction or other. What do you think of this? I mean, you people actually make things yourself, so you can't really seriously wave the flag for a world of purely unmade things because of what you do for a living. But on the other hand, I mean, is there another hand? What do you think?
The question is about GMO and...
No. I mean, well, genetically in the very broadest sense. Like, I mean, there is a DIY movement in which people just go home in high school and they make stuff and they make organisms. What do you think of that?
Could people hear that? I'm looking at you in the very far back.
Couldn't hear it.
Yeah, couldn't hear it. Let me repeat.
I mean, I think molecular technologies and the molecular industry is like every other industry, right? There are going to be unforeseen things, and we know pretty much that the public doesn't want it, and very likely it's not needed. So how are we going to trust the same companies? I mean, the genetic agricultural industry is run by the same people who brought us the pesticide industry and the fertilizer industry, all of which have had dramatically detrimental effects. So, I think that in the same way, we just have to be extremely cautious about a group of people who we've learned over and over and over again can't be trusted, right?
The point is that there are kids doing this.
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
So it's not an industry thing.
there are art schools that have programs that do this.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
Another question out there? Yeah, in the front here.
I wanted to ask about both of your relationships to libraries. I think of them as having a lot in common with museums, especially in the fact that a library's main role isn't necessarily to catalog and to archive things, but it is part of its role. So I wondered, how do you use that as a tool, and how do you view that as something that endures into the future and benefits people?
asking about their relationship to libraries.
I feel about libraries the way Mark feels about museums. I think once everything is in there, it should never be touched. Nothing should ever be taken out of it. The card catalog shouldn't be touched.
Yeah.
If you want to digitize it, fine, but that should be separate. Don't get rid of anything. And they serve that same function. An old library that has bought things continuously since the late 17th, early 18th century and held on to it becomes, in effect, a museum of itself. And those are irreplaceable, and I spend a lot of time in them and have learned a great deal from them. So even though I love the ease of going, being able to look up anything online or being able to see anything reproduced, it still really is never the same as going to look at the actual old newspapers, the actual old books, as seeing the old books in their same order they always were on the old glass shelves held up by the cast iron brackets. It's not just the book that's important, it's the context in which the book is found and stored and read and touched by people. All of that is magical to me, and I would never have written without those libraries, without access to them. That was really my whole education. I didn't come from an environment where there were many books. I was pretty poorly educated. Most of what I know I learned later by myself in libraries, so I think of them as precious and essential, really important.
I would say the same. I mean, the library saved my life. The bookmobile
the
saved my life.
Me
That
too.
was, as I said, I didn't have books in the house, but the bookmobile, I had a new crop of books every week and would check out the maximum number of books every week. And also, there were lots of special learning programs in the library. There were lots of young people who, I had a lot of reading problems early on, and there were programs I would do at the library, and people helped me. And the library was so amazing. And I grew up in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, which has this amazing library, which is this this sort of Romanesque treasure that with stained glass windows and copper roof and spiral staircases and marble floors and a painting by Albert Bierstadt. I mean, it's just phenomenal, right? And that's where we would spend all our time. And something like when getting rid of books, when I go to a library and they have a sale of things they're discarding, and you see these treasures that they're selling for 99 cents, I just feel betrayed. I feel like, how can you do this? You're supposed to be the guardians of this stuff, and you're selling it for nothing.
We had bookmobile too. It was the best thing ever.
So maybe be our last question, yeah.
So my question to you, Mark, is a lot of your work documents sort of the horrible things that we as humans do to the natural world, and yet people still embrace your work, and a lot of people who enjoy it and appreciate it and recognize it are complicit in those things. What do you think is going on sort of for those people and your work and how they consume it?
Well, as am I complicit in these things as well? I think that, I'm really not interested in standing outside of that and wagging my finger at everyone who doesn't agree. I mean, that's why the works sometimes have a kind of brutality to them, and there's things I don't take pleasure in, like catching butterflies and pinning them for my art, but it's part of it, and part of that is a kind of expression of brutality and domination that I'm trying to talk about, but I also am doing, and I think that's, I'm absolutely not someone who knows how we get out of this. I'm not part of that group of artists who are hunting down solutions. I'm more part of the group of artists who are trying to figure out how we got here in the first place. I think that the work wouldn't be as powerful if I could step out of it. I'm not really interested in these, in a kind of environmental sainthood. I'm more interested in being implicated in the same thing probably many of us in this room are implicated in, and yet at the same time feeling incredibly ambivalent about it. I think one of the things that art does very well expresses very difficult things, very difficult feelings like ambivalence, like contradiction, like insecurity, like doubt, you know, and those are hard. Those are very hard things to express in other forms, and certainly in forms like documentary and journalism, for example.
I can't really add to that. We're very lucky as artists that we have the ability to make up things and to abstract things that get us to look at our feelings in a different way. Nonfiction is incredibly interesting and incredibly powerful, and documentary film is incredibly interesting and incredibly powerful, but it does something different than we do. We're, I think, largely as artists, we're that old truism, we're askers of questions rather than answerers of questions. It's not really our job to answer them. I don't think we know how. If we pose the questions correctly, then that's a good thing in itself, I hope.
Do you all listen to music while you work?
Yeah, but I'm not telling you what music.
I don't mostly. Because I'm listening to the music of the sentences in my ears, and I write so much by ear, but when I was younger and used to go to artist colony, I was always so envious of the visual artists because I'd walk past their studios and these glorious sounds would be coming out, and, you know, and they'd be collaborating sometimes with each other. There'd be music and drinking and fun, and I would go back to my writer's studio of gloom and solitude and darkness, you know, and just... We have much less fun than visual artists do.
Everybody should be artists.
Yeah.
That's how we move forward this. Well, thank you both so much, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thank you all.